back in the swing of things after a week off, and back at the kitchen table of Amherst astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed.
But a lot of things happened while you were away. Europa Clipper
Yeah,
got launched.
went off without a hitch.
SpaceX came back and or its booster rocket and came back and it was caught in a proper way. And we had Northern Lights, which I remember calling you and go like, Monty, go out.
Go outside and see them now. That was right before we left, but then the comet.
And then the comet. So,
which I didn't get to see. I tried 3 times. I didn't get to see it. You had some beautiful photos from here in Amherst.
Just with the iPhone. I mean, you could see it last week. I think you can still see it in the evening skies, and now it's a little bit higher in the sky. I think part of the problem is the moon. So when the moon is not up, but
bright.
Early evening now, you won't have the moon, and so no, actually, it won't. Yeah, so the moon is the problem.
Yeah, stupid moon.
Exactly. So the moon is the issue. Otherwise, you would have beautiful views. But maybe you can still try to find it. It is cool. It has a long tail, and it's now moving farther and farther away from the sun, which you can actually see in there. So let's see how it goes.
I'll keep trying. A shout out to our engineer at NEPM, Chuck Dubé, who sent an email out to the whole staff about how to view the comet, and then ended it with, "I'm not pretending to be Salman Hameed. I just wanted you to know." And I was like, that was very sweet. While we were away, he's stepping in to make sure everybody can see the comet. But we are talking about things that are way more depressing. Nothing starts out your back to work week like nuclear war and its connections to Western Massachusetts.
Right, and my apologies to you, Monty.
Yeah.
I know this is your first day back,
Yeah,
but
you sent me all these articles like, we're going to talk about nuclear war. I was like, oh, great. Quite the Monday.
but there were a couple of reasons I wanted to bring it up. First of all, I think from astronomy perspective, and when people talk about searching for life in the universe or intelligent life in the universe, there was this Drake equation that Frank Drake and Carl Sagan worked out back in the 1960s. And of course, 1960s, the nuclear threat, people were quite aware of that. And that threat remained on people's minds. And one of the variables in the Drake equation was called L. And L was the lifetime of a communicating civilization. So if you are looking for signals from extraterrestrial intelligence, one of the biggest factors, and that was one of their estimates in there, of course, the Drake equation is a total guess of how many communicating civilizations are out there in the universe. And so if you want to have a higher probability in that sense, you would like to have those civilizations live for a long period of time. And what they discovered was that this particular variable, L, was the lifetime of a communicating civilization. And because we only have one example, and that is us, to think about, one of their things was like, well, we have, once we develop the technology to communicate across interstellar distances, we also develop the technology to completely annihilate us because of the nuclear weapons. Of course, now there are other ways to go out too. For example, climate change and now the robots and all AI.
We keep coming up with new and better ways to destroy ourselves.
And that was one of their things that, well, if this is the path that most civilizations take. Now, from a sociology perspective, there are whole other issues with that, like how much we can generalize from what one species on this planet do. Nevertheless, you can think of it in reverse, that maybe this is the path that these kind of intelligent species, when they develop the technology to communicate, also develop the technology to kill themselves. And hence, if we don't find anyone, it might be because, civilizations don't survive. And if we do find a signal, that would be a hopeful sign that this technological civilizations can survive. So that was, a long way of saying that, no, we should not destroy ourselves.
Yes, and yet we look like we're getting closer and closer. Although we were a little bit closer to what seemed like a potential nuclear war with the situation in Russia and Ukraine. It has cooled a little bit over the course of the last year. But that whole atomic clock, that scientists try to use to indicate the level of threat of potential nuclear annihilation has never been closer to midnight, I believe, than since the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps. And there are many people in Western Massachusetts who are advocating for total nuclear disarmament globally, and protesting therein. But let's talk about what some of the new developments have been in the world of nuclear technology in the United States in particular.
Well, so a couple of things. One is that the Nobel Peace Prize actually went to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, and I think that is again that reminds us about the horrors of nuclear bombs, and it was poignant that like they actually said that they were surprised that they got the Nobel Peace Prize and not the workers, health workers in particular in Gaza, because they found sort of like some of the conditions that the people are experiencing in Gaza that reminded them of some of the conditions 80 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's again that just reminds you about the horrors of wars in general. But on a larger scale, I think why I wanted to bring it up, and I know there are a lot of activists in the region, for example, Ira Helfand, and there are...
He's a doctor in Northampton, physician. He's been part of two Nobel Peace Prize winning organizations that have been, both of which have advocated for the dangers of nuclear war. Advocated, warning us about the dangers of nuclear war.
And there are other people who are also part of the ICAN, which is the, I think, International Committee for the Abolishment of Nuclear Weapons. You also have Daniel Ellsberg papers, and Daniel Ellsberg himself, who was really against nuclear weapons. And
his papers are now at UMass Amherst, after he's the one who released the Pentagon Papers, which largely helped to end the Vietnam War.
So all of that said, there are the things that are happening in New England as well, was actually disclosed recently in an article in the New York Times. It was a front page article, I think, 2 weeks ago, in which it talked about defense contractors giving talks to in elementary schools across New England. And they were actually referring to mostly in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where you have a defense contractor that actually has been given a contract to build nuclear submarines. And submarines are the most important one, because in the case of nuclear war, they are supposed to be sort of like, going in the ocean, and and they cannot be targeted in a particular place, and then they can actually launch retaliatory or whatever nuclear weapons from it. And US, I think, right now has 14, but now they are building 12 more to refurbish them or whatever. Not refurbish them, but certainly
to update the technology. Yes, the whole nuclear arsenal is going through a technological update.
And a couple of things that struck me. So this defense contractor was General Dynamics, and they have a contract, of course, from the US Navy. But the fact that they are going into elementary schools, giving these talks in the hopes of inspiring some of these kids, that eventually they will work for them get interested in submarines, and of course nuclear submarines. To me, that was just shocking in some sense, because this reminded me, coming from South Asia, coming from Pakistan, or with the neighboring Afghanistan over there, you often hear these stories of indoctrination. Oh my goodness, and Taliban in Afghanistan are indoctrinating kids. Well, I mean, isn't this indoctrination in that sense? So to me, first of all, that was a little shocking from that perspective, but also the amount of money that U.S. is spending. So this money is already being planned for. $1.7 trillion to upgrade U.S. Nuclear arsenal over 30 years. And this goes back to this larger question that on the one hand, we keep on talking about, well, the abolishment of nuclear weapons. And there have been Nobel Prizes being given for these efforts, but we are going in the opposite direction. And New York Times, again, I mean, there can be a lot of criticism of New York Times, but I think they have been doing a good job. They had a special issue called At the Brink that was in March of 2024, and that was precisely the point that people have actually forgotten that we are that where or how scary nuclear weapons or nuclear wars can be, and rather instead we are actually going in the opposite direction. And so in this particular case, $1.7 trillion over 30 years, and in the article actually they helpfully calculated that it is about $108,000 per minute for 30 years. That's going, and not for social services, not for building hospitals, not for sort of that, hey, can we reduce inequity? No. For $108,000 per minute, we are going to be spending
for 30 years.
For 30 years for building weapons that can destroy the entire world. And how many weapons do we need? And just juxtaposition of that, because my son goes to Amherst school system and Crocker Elementary School, and they are having budget cuts, for example, and they are having trouble figuring out what to do with the education, and so they have a $2 million budget shortfall for next year, and they are figuring out what to do in the Amherst school system, Amherst Pelham. And I was thinking, hey, that's 20 minutes. In 20 minutes of this budget, you can actually really solve the problem of Amherst Pelham schools, and that is related to the school system for which these defense contractors are going to give lectures to recruit them in the New England area.
I'll also say another local tie-in. For a long time, an organization called the National Priorities Project, which has merged with another larger organization, was based in Northampton. It included, as its director for a time, now State Senator Joe Comerford. Their job was to crunch the federal budget, just to show you how these exact types of numbers, $108,000 a minute for 30 years, to totally revitalize the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And what are our priorities? That's why they called it the National Priorities Project. Is our priority to revitalize the nuclear arsenal at this extraordinary fee, or is it to figure out ways to support the Amherst school system and other school systems across the country?
And again, how do we think about these things? I mean, again, these numbers seem big, but just to give, even within the nuclear perspective, that the Manhattan Project, over the course of World War II, was about $30 billion inflation adjusted. So in today's dollars, it would be $30 billion. This upgrade of nuclear weapons program, that is about twice that per year. Twice that of the Manhattan Project, which we considered as sort of this big thing. So I think this puts back the reason why I wanted to bring it up, partly because of the Nobel Peace Prize that was given, but also I think people have forgotten how scary nuclear war can be. I mean, people have talked about, there have been interviews with the survivors talking about sort of that they saw sort of people carrying eyeballs, for example, before collapsing into the ground, and and they were burned, and so those type of things. Of course, The Day After, which was a movie in the 1980s, which became a big hit at the time and really scared people, and I think that's the type of thing which we need to come back, because this is happening. And again, what's happening in the rest of the world? Of course, there are other nuclear countries as well. There are 12,000 right now nuclear bombs or nuclear warheads in the world. Well, that's a huge number. Obviously, one is more than enough, but there are 12,000. Yes, Russia has those. China has those, and China has about 400. U.S. and Russia has, I think, close to around over 3,500 nuclear weapons. Pakistan, where I'm from, Pakistan, I think, has over 150. India has over 150. Israel has those. North Korea, and of course UK, France. Just for the heck of it, they're just keeping them So yes, there are all of those things, but we are here in the U.S. And this 1.7, you have to imagine, well, they are doing something. Well, sure, whatever they might be doing, the question is, what are we doing? And we are spending $108,000 per minute on building up upgrading our nuclear program. And this is not something that is going to happen. This is not something that is fictional. Just 2 weeks ago, in fact, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which was where the Manhattan Project was based. And if you watch Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it was. They have just started up a program to produce what are called the first plutonium pits. Again, they had stopped producing those. That's the central component, the sort of like bowling ball sized key component that goes into the nuclear weapons. They have started producing that right now. Their goal is to produce 30 pits. These are plutonium pits. 30 pits per year with an additional 50. So that will make it 80 pits per year by the mid 2030s. Goes back to this question, how many nuclear bombs do we need? They will be producing 80 by the end of 2030, 80 plutonium pits. It's not just about the warheads, just about nuclear weapons itself, but also the environmental issues, because at the places that these are produced, it also causes environmental damage. It also produces radiation issues for the local population. There have been cases before. There have been protests. In some places, the courts have stepped in to stop these type of things, but not in Los Alamos. This was the news item that came up just 2 weeks ago.
I'll also say, just last month, there was a great story in the Daily Hampshire Gazette, our local newspaper, about demilitarized Western Mass and the protests that have been ongoing at L3 Harris in Northampton, which, if you didn't know, is a place where components for nuclear submarines are being created right here in the peace-loving Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts. And I will also highly recommend the digital versions of the articles that you sent to me, Salman, by W.J. Hennigan from the New York Times. The way that they are crafted in an interactive sense, I'm not a big fan of reading news articles on my phone, frankly, but I did it. And the way that it graphically takes you through how graphic the devastation would be, even with a small scale nuclear war, the famine that would be created across the globe, that would translate into the sheer numbers of millions of people who would starve to death with a small scale nuclear war. A lot of people like to say, if India and Pakistan were to launch against each other, being so close neighbors, even 100 nuclear warheads, there would be millions, if not billions, of people across the country who would be either directly affected or die.
And the bigger threat is more tactical nuclear weapons, which Russia threatened recently to use in case if they start to lose the war. And that was actually a scenario at one point, that if the Ukrainian forces had broken through to Crimea, then they might have used these tactical nuclear weapons that are smaller in size than the city-destroyed one. And in the New York Times interactive one, that is precisely that point, that it is time to, again, really imagine. We haven't really imagined what it would look like. And the scenario that they portrayed, which I think is very effective, is a nuclear bomb that is about half the size of the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. And what would follow? What would happen within the blast zone? What would happen to people who are a little bit farther away? What would happen in the long term? And so I think, and it's horrific. I mean, if you look at those things and then connect that to the fact that we have people coming in and talking to elementary school kids about nuclear submarines, or you have our own local companies in this area producing components for that, you have to put those two things together, and it really brings back to this insanity. For what? And so you spend this $108,000 a minute, but you are not doing that for, hey, forget about this wonderful thing about the Europa Clipper mission that went, and you go like, look what humans are capable of, but then you have this complete destruction. So you're not putting $100,000 per minute for something that we can be proud of as humans. We are producing this. What we are trying to do is potentially, I mean, it has not potentially, I mean, it has the ability to end humanity. And we hope that doesn't happen, but we certainly have the means to do it.
Well, it is spooky season, and it's Halloween's right around the corner, so if you were looking for some horror for your Monday afternoon, now you have it.